So what is a mind? In order to figure out whether an animal, a plant, or even a computer has a mind, we need to figure out what our minds are. Science can tell us how minds work, but they can't tell us what minds are. René Descartes suggested that a mind is a thing that thinks, by which he meant that it doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, imagines, and senses. And he famously argued that minds were different from the physical body, that the two were separable in principle, if not in fact. And this sort of dualism is comforting because then our minds can go to heaven when we die, and we can send our minds to other worlds and other exciting possibilities. But dualism also creates some serious problems. If the mind is not physical, how can it cause physical changes, like my arm moving like this? The problem of causal interaction was a problem already when Descartes introduced dualism, but it's only become more of a problem as we've discovered more about how physical causal processes operate. Science may not be able to tell us what a mind is, but it does set limits on what it can do. And at this point, a hard limit is that only physical causes can have physical effects. That means we need to try to find a way to understand the mind as a feature of the physical world, rather than as an essentially different sort of thing. In this series, I want to suggest that the mind is a representational system. That is, the mind is a thing that represents. And that doesn't seem like it's very different from Descartes' idea that the mind is a thing that thinks, which I take to be a point in its favor. After all, Descartes was a pretty smart guy for all the bad press that he's received. And thinking, sensing, and willing are all ways of representing. The challenge will be to explain representation as a feature of the physical world. Our first step is to lay out a basic description of what a representation is. To do that, we turn to Josef Perner, a developmental psychologist, who explains that a representation is a relation between the medium or vehicle of representation and the object it represents. In terms of the mind, my thought or perception of a cup represents the cup when it is in this representing relation to the cup. And if the vehicle is a brain process, if my representation is a brain process, then what that is that it's a certain kind of brain process that's in this right representing relation to the cup. Representation refers to the vehicle, the brain process, or whatever it is that's representing the cup. But it's tempting to use it to refer to the object when the object doesn't exist, like a unicorn. So it's pretty obvious that there's a cup, and then there's a representation, a brain process that's about the cup. But if it's a unicorn and this doesn't exist, and I'm just imagining a unicorn, then it's tempting to say, well, this is the representation that, it's just a representation that is the unicorn. So there's this ambiguity between what is in the head that represents the thing in the world, and so what's in the head has content about the thing in the world, and the thing that's in the world itself. So those two things, the content and the object, can also get conflated. So we need to keep track of these different things: the vehicle, which is whatever it is that carries the content, which is what the representation is about, and then the object that the content is about, that the representation represents. So keep track of these differences, the difference between the vehicle and the content and the object. And this is going to be a challenge. I still struggle with this myself. Just remember that the vehicle is what carries the content is what the representation represents, and the object is that thing, the thing that the content is about, that the representation is about. The key question that we'll be asking then is, what determines the representation relation? What is it that makes a representation have the content that it has? How does it come to represent an object like a cup? A Another important aspect of representations is that they always represent in a particular way. They represent things as something. So look at these two pictures. On the left, we have a representation of a wild turkey, but it doesn't represent the object as being a wild turkey. It just looks like a blurry blob. The picture on the right represents the turkeys as turkeys. That is, they're represented as sharing distinctive features of turkeys, and so they're easily recognizable as turkeys. Frege develops a similar distinction when he talks about reference and sense. So he says the referent is the object that's represented, so that's the turkey out there in the world, and sense is the way the object is represented. So it might be represented distinctly as a turkey in the photos on the right, or it might be represented as a blurry blob. One question to ask is how the blurry picture could come to be a representation of a turkey, even though it's not clearly represented as a turkey. Still, the primary question is what determines a representation at all? What makes something a representation? To help answer this question, Perner offers 4 criteria for representations, which he uses to determine which theory best satisfies these criteria. So first is asymmetry. A representation is about its object, but the object is not about its representation. So the picture is about the turkey, but the turkey isn't about the picture. Second, singularity. A representation is only about its target object, even if some other object is indistinguishable from the target object. So the picture is only a picture of the specific turkey that it represents. There was one turkey that the bad photographer took a picture of. That's the turkey that the picture represents. And so even if there's another turkey that looks just like this turkey, this representation is a representation just of one single turkey. It's just of what it's about. Third, misrepresentation. A representation may fail to represent its object. And this criterion is really important and often overlooked. So the picture fails to represent a turkey in a way because it doesn't look like a turkey. It looks like a blob. But it has to be about a turkey in some way. It has to succeed in some way as a representation in order to misrepresent it as a turkey. Otherwise, you could say it's an accurate representation of a blob. So what makes it a misrepresentation rather than being no representation at all? And you need a particular theory of a representation in order to be able to distinguish those two things. And then finally, non-existence. A representation may represent an object that does not exist. And while this photograph does represent a turkey, there was something that was the object that this photographer badly represented. It's not necessarily the case. So I can have a thought about something that doesn't exist. I can have a thought about a unicorn. And a good theory of representation, an adequate theory of representation, has to account for how you could represent something that doesn't exist. Now that we have the 4 criteria in mind, we can ask what makes something represent something else. What is it that constitutes representation? So how are we going to satisfy this representational relation? And Perner considers 2 ways of answering this question. First, the intentionalist, and I'll call this the internalist versus externalist. He calls it intentionalist and naturalist, but internalism and externalism is a way that in philosophy of mind this distinction has been captured. So I'll talk about internalist versus externalist. So the internalist, the intentionalist way, is that the mind determines what things are represented. So here, the intention of the user, I am thinking that it's a turkey, or I think that this is a cup, or something about me then determines that this is the content of the representation. So maybe it's the internal structure, the way my representations are related to one another. Maybe it's an internal functional relation. So maybe it's a particular kind of functional relation of my mental contents that allows me to represent in this certain kind of way. Alternatively, the naturalist or externalist view is that some natural process determines what things are represented. And Perner favors three different naturalist approaches and develops those in more detail. The first is the resemblance theory, which is that the mind makes a copy of the objects it represents. So on this view, what it is to represent this cup is that my mind has some kind of a copy or picture that is about this cup in a way that the relationship is not just internal, but it matches in an important way what the features in the world are. So that's what makes it externalist, is that you've got some mirroring or picturing relation between what's going on inside and what's going on outside. The second possibility is the causal theory, that objects cause the mind to form representations. And on this view, something in the world then has a kind of causal process by which it generates representations in my mind. Locke talked about this as a kind of impression from the world that caused representations. And the third is functional theory. And here, representations need to be used by the mind. They're caused by an object and also cause the user to behave appropriately in relation to the object. So on the functional view, what it is for me to have a representation of the cup is that I use it in a particular way. I use it to drink things in the morning, and it's useful to me because it causes me to have representations of it, and also because those representations then are used in a particular sort of way. So think about what sort of answer makes sense to you. Is it an internalist or an externalist answer? How do you come to have your thoughts, and how do your thoughts come to be about the things that they're about? Tables, chairs, cups, unicorns. Is it something about the mind that it does it on its own, or is it the connection that it has to the things in the world that it might be representing? Does there need to be a cup or features of the cup as a source of representation, or does the idea of the cup emerge from the way the mind works separately from the way in which physical objects are arranged? So think about these responses. This is our primary question. How does the mind come to represent?